This video will take you through blocks and their use in a sample round and end with a practice activity for you to try it out yourself. So today we'll be going through an example using this resolution, which is from January 2017, which is resolved: in order to better respond to international conflicts, the United States should significantly increase its military spending. I picked it because it's a pretty simple topic on its surface level, so common arguments should be pretty easy to understand without any research on the topic beforehand. So imagine that you are arguing against this resolution. So this means that you are a con. And let's just take one common con argument, so something that you would have in your case. And that is increased spending will damage our economy. So basically saying that military spending is already too high. Okay, and on top of this argument, you're going to have some supporting evidence. And so the piece of evidence that you have in your case is that recent wars have been extremely expensive, and military activities in Iraq and Afghanistan produced $1.1 trillion in direct costs through 2010. So that's around a decade, starting from around 2001. And so this would be the evidence that you would provide in your case in round. And let's say, for example, your opponent comes up during the rebuttal and says that, in fact, military spending is actually stable or declining if you look at it as a percentage of total spending in GDP. So basically what this is saying is that this $1.1 trillion, although it may seem big to a common person, when taken in a larger context of the United States and their spending, is actually not a considerable change from what they've had in the past. And on top of this, they have evidence to support their claim. So they have a quote from the Council on Foreign Relations that says, in the post-Cold War world, the U.S. national defense budget has fluctuated within a relatively narrow band. Again, just a fancy way of saying that the spending has actually not increased over time in terms of total U.S. spending. Okay, so if you were to come across this in a round, you might want to say, well, you know, $1.1 trillion is still a lot. We want to bring that down. But obviously that's not a strong argument, like on top of the fact that your opponent has strong evidence claiming that this actually isn't a significant increase. So blocks can be used in this scenario to kind of shift the impact. And what I mean by that is, instead of trying to kind of ram in the fact that you're trying to say that this $1.1 trillion is a huge impact and, you know, should support your case, you might want to take a step back and think about it in a different perspective. So that's when you can prepare a potential block. So let's say that even if military spending is not changing as a percentage of total GDP, what is changing is the US debt. So this is the quote that we have. By 2010, average income has risen to $46,000+, but the wars had increased the average debt burden by $4,200 per person, raising the federal debt to income ratio by almost 9 percentage points. So I think the most impactful statement in this quote is this right here. As an individual, and your judge as an individual can tell that, an additional $4,200 of cost onto that person is a pretty big cost to endure. And you're even saying that the federal debt has increased by 9 percentage points. So by shifting away from direct costs and looking towards not only the debt for the federal level, but also on an individual level, you're kind of shifting away from this refutation that your opponent brings and kind of supplements your initial evidence with another impact, which is increased debt. And so not only would you not include this in your initial argumentation just because you might not have had enough time or space to include it in your contention, but this is also a separate impact that can, just be saved for direct refutations that might come during your case. And so if a judge were to hear something like this added, say during a crossfire or summary, that could give you some good points towards your case. So this was just one example of it being used in round. Just to summarize, this is the resolution that we're using. In this case, you are con. The common con argument, so this could be the head of your contention, is increased spending will damage our economy. One of the main pieces of evidence that you have is that past wars, such as in Iraq and Afghanistan, produced a large $1.1 trillion in direct costs, but that is refuted during your opponent's rebuttal by shifting it into a percentage of total spending. But you're able to refute that back by your potential block, which would be pre-prepared with a quote that says that average burden has increased in terms of debt, and even looking at a federal level, it increased by almost 9 percentage points. Okay, so now that I've led you through this example, actually before we get to the activity, one thing I'd like to show you is the entire card. So if you haven't watched or read the past activities from previous weeks, one of the weeks went over cards, which are basically pieces of evidence that you've used in case. The same goes for blocks. If you're going to bring up a new block with an outside source through a quote, you also want to have the evidence stored somewhere on your computer or printed out. So you can see this has the source on the top with the name and the date, and the entire card from which the quote came from. So you can see the quote about here, by 2010, average income had blah, blah, blah. So one thing that could be beneficial by having this card is not only if your opponent says, hey, I want to see where you got this quote from to validate it, you can show them it right here. But also, if you looked further down in the card that you had pulled up, so this is the entire paragraph where it came from, you can see that they even talk about total debt as a share of GDP. It says it's projected to be much higher at 76.2% by 2020. Obviously, this is older at 2011, but the importance of having this card can also be that you can find evidence in this that may actually more directly refute your opponent's argumentation, which was that military spending is stable or declining as a percentage of total GDP. So then you have an apples to apples comparison with something that you really didn't think was that important or impactful. Okay, with that example out of the way, let's go to an example for you to try out. So again, imagine that you're still con in this case, and your con argument is that increased military spending tends to spur international conflict rather than reduce or mitigate it. Okay, and so your explanation for this is that U.S. intervention can be counterproductive since it intensifies smaller, less powerful countries' fears of America's authoritarian intentions, which is pretty reasonable, right? This can be seen by many smaller countries, even bigger countries like Brazil, They tend not to want US or larger countries' intervention because they see it as, some dominating power or a colonizing effort that has, occurred in the past as well. And so one thing that you can do is, if this was your case and you were developing it, even before you get into the round, one thing is you can use this argument and create a block for the pro side. So if you were to look at this from the other side and say, okay, my opponent just came up to me with this argument that increased military spending spurs international conflict, then what can you do as a pro to attack this? And so if you think like that while you're practicing or you're developing your cases, you can actually come up with some pretty good blocks. And in addition to that, you can find holes in your argument. And so before I let you loose, let me talk about 2 ways to approach this that I would think of on first thought. So the first thing, right, is I would say, okay, let's try to find an example of where intervention is not counterproductive. And so we would find an example of the US being positively received as a peacemaker. This has been an example in many cases, right? We can look towards in the Middle East, relieving tensions in the past, in Africa, relieving tensions in the past, and we can look at positive relationships between the US and other countries in those areas. And so basically just find an example that counters this. Another slightly more difficult example to find is example of the US failing to keep the peace as a result of a restricted budget. The reason why this is maybe a better block for you is that you can say, okay, well, it may be counterproductive, but the reason it's counterproductive is because we didn't have a high enough military budget. And so then you kind of turn your opponent's impact, which is that it's counterproductive, intensifying their fears of America, and saying that, okay, this will happen if we didn't increase military spending. And so this would be perfect to find as a block. And this example would actually be a good thing to see, okay, maybe this argument isn't that strong, let me find some ways to reinforce it. So there's many ways that you can improve your own case, both before you go into the round and during the round, just by going through this exercise of looking at your case, trying to find common counter arguments to it, and either finding blocks or using that to fill in the holes in your argument before you go into the round. And so that was just a quick example and activity, some clarifying points that can supplement the written explanation, and I hope you enjoyed the video.